Welcome. Thank you for joining today. Today we're launching a new guide for mobile network operators called Achieving Climate Targets. And it's been a while in the making. We've been working on this for about the last year, trying to keep up with the rapid developments that's happening in climate action across the industry and beyond. But this guide really builds on all of the amazing work that's been happening over recent years. And we can cast our mind back actually to 2019 when the board of the GSMA set an ambition for the mobile industry to be net zero by 2050. And since then, we've actually developed the sector pathway for the ICT sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And the GSMA has been focused on supporting our members with disclosing and understanding climate impacts and then aligning targets to the ICT sector pathway. And it's now 2023, and we have many mobile network operators that have committed to these really ambitious and challenging science-based targets. So we thought it was time to provide some support on how to achieve these targets. And the good news is that they are completely achievable. That doesn't mean that they don't require a huge amount of transformation, because they certainly do, but we know what needs to be done. So I'm very pleased today to be joined by several special guests who can help explain what's achievable and how we can actually progress against these targets. So firstly, the Carbon Trust. We created the guide with the Carbon Trust. We'll also be hearing from leading operators on how they're reducing their own carbon emissions. TDC in Denmark on the switch to renewable electricity. And then we'll be speaking to BT and Vodafone on how they're tackling the tricky issue of supply chain emissions. A quick note, at any point during this webinar, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments box underneath. We hope to have time for some Q&A at the end of the presentations and discussion, so we'll pick up some of your questions then. But there's a lot to cover, so let's kick off. And now I'm going to hand over to Charlotte Kirkman, consultant at the Carbon Trust, who's going to introduce us to the guide. Charlotte, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, and hi, everyone. If we could just move on to the next slide. We are really excited to share this guide with you today, and we're hopeful that it's going to be a really useful tool and resource for all of you. And what I'm going to talk to you today is just a bit about the structure and contents of the guide, which hopefully a few of you had already had a bit of a chance to look through. So a bit of the wider context is obviously that many companies, and hopefully lots of you, will have set your science-based targets and are now going to be looking to how you can achieve them. And we just want to add in the sort of wider context of the corporate net zero standard, which has been recently released and which distinguishes between your near-term science-based targets, which are those 5 to 10 year targets, and then also the longer-term science-based targets, which will help you reach net zero by 2050, whichever date you've chosen. So this guide is really designed to help you achieve those near-term targets. So we're really looking at that 5 to 10 year horizon. If you just hop on to the next slide. So you can see this graphic here is a bit of a cumulative summary of all mobile network operators that have set science-based targets over the last few years. So the guide that we've produced basically builds on the Setting Climate Targets guide, which we released in collaboration with the GSMA several years ago. And this sequel guide has step-by-step instructions and suggestions on how you can develop a plan to achieve your targets and adapt that for your organization. So if we move on to the next slide. So hopefully some of you have already had a chance to look through the guide. And what I'd say about it is that it's a really, really packed resource. There is tons of information in there, which hopefully you will find extremely useful. But we've also designed it with usability in mind. So we want it to be as user-friendly as possible. So on each page, you'll see there are key actions and considerations, which are highlighted in bold and green and with a little symbol you can see in the top left box there. So you can really look through the guide, consider those key actions, work out which ones are most relevant for you, and then look into the detail behind those. We've also included multiple case studies across lots of the different areas. So you can see how other mobile network operators have put some of the suggestions into action, which we're hoping will be extremely useful for you. And we've also developed some model roadmaps, which you can see an example of on the right here, and we'll go into one of those in a bit more detail later on. But essentially that says, what is your footprint looking like now? How big is it going to grow in a business as usual scenario? And therefore, what are the cumulative steps you're going to need to take to reach that target? So if we move on again. So the guide, really lays out 3 key steps to help you achieve your targets, which are laid out in the chevron here. So first step is assessing your emission hotspots. Second step is identifying emission reduction opportunities. And then the third step is developing the implementation plan to put those opportunities into action. And you're all going to be on slightly different stages of the journey. So some of you may be able to skip ahead to the relevant sections of the guide, and some of you might be right at the start and just assessing your emission hotspots. So you can basically start wherever you need to, depending on where you are on that journey. We move on to the next slide. So yes, this very first section on assessing emission hotspots. So the guide essentially includes an example footprint for a typical mobile network operator. And hopefully lots of you are all familiar with your own footprints. But this example footprint is an opportunity for us to call out what are the most typical hotspots for your organizations. So as you can see in the example footprint here, it's expected that your scope 1 emissions are probably going to be the smallest. Your scope 2 emissions are likely to be considerably larger, depending on where you are on your renewables journey. And then your scope 3 emissions, that's all the emissions in your value chain, are likely to be the largest section. And the guide lays out different approaches for addressing reductions in each of those different scopes, which we will go through in this session. If we just move on again. Great. So in the guide, for emission reduction opportunities to address your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, we essentially lay out the different opportunities in a tabular format like this. So this is one of the example opportunities from scope 1. So the example we've got here is switching to renewable generation at your network base stations to decrease the reliance on diesel power generators. And what we do is we basically assess that opportunity against a number of different criteria. So you'll have a full rounded understanding of what it might take to implement that opportunity and what the expected outcome might be. So the key criteria that we consider is the ease of implementation and key barriers, the expected time frame for commencing implementation, the required CapEx investment, but also the return on investment. So for this example, if you're moving to renewables generation, you're decreasing your spend on diesel and scope 2, your electricity as well. And then we also, most importantly, consider the magnitude of carbon reduction potential for each opportunity. So you can basically select the opportunities that are going to have the biggest impact for your organization. That's everything from me. I'll hand back to Stephen.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. Appreciate you running through that with us and giving us an overview of the guide. So sticking with scope 2 emissions and thinking particularly about how they can be reduced and the switch to renewable energy, I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Andersen, who is the Senior Director and Head of Sustainability at TDC Net in Denmark. Peter, we'd love to find out more about how you and TDC Net are reducing scope 2 emissions and your renewables journey. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the GSMA and also to Carbon Trust for putting a increased focus on what we're doing here. This is, the challenge of our generation. So I think it's important what you do. So thanks for putting an emphasis on that. If we move to the next slide, I've been asked to share a bit about how we, as the leading digital infrastructure provider in Denmark, are transitioning to renewables, which is a huge part of our plan. If we move to the next slide, first of all, our ambition is to be net zero across our value chain in 2030. And we are proud to be the first company in the world to actually receive a validation of a 2030 net zero from the Science Based Targets initiative last year. So our near-term and long-term targets are actually the same, which of course makes it easier. Then we just have to deliver. But I think the reason for going bold on this was that we see an opportunity for digital infrastructure providers like ourselves to move early on this agenda and go to zero early, because our analysis show that a heavy part of our emissions are in scope 2, where we with renewable electricity can make a huge difference. On the next page, you can see a page here from our annual sustainability report, which was published a few months ago, where we basically lay out the journey to net zero, where we want to reach net zero on scope 1 and 2 already in 2028, and then finally across the value chain in 2030. And some of the key initiatives are similar to a lot of other operators, I believe, which is of course energy efficiency on scope 1 and 2, transition of our fleet, but then as mentioned also renewable energy and coverage with renewables is a key part of it. And if we move to the next slide, because that's the focus of this presentation, when we looked at how we could make an impact, it was important for us in TDCnet to prioritize the initiatives that are best for the environment. So we have a big focus on reducing as much as possible first, regenerating and using the energy we have, surplus energy from, for example, some of our equipment, reusing that before sourcing green and responsible. But when you then have to source, because you have to use some energy with all the increased digitalization and data transport that is going through our networks, then it was important for us to have a green and responsible choice of source. So on the next page, we kind of showed the different criteria which was important for us in evaluating the different options for going renewable. We had the option of buying certificates from already existing renewable energy, but we ended up going with power purchasing agreements as our choice, because additionality, as you can see here on the left-hand side, was a big priority for us. Then we also looked at the technology mix and chose a technology of solar panels. The other option that we liked well was wind, and that was because in our market in Denmark, wind and solar was good options to go for. Geography was our third priority. We wanted to produce the renewable energy as close to the source as possible, so as close to where we were actually using the energy, in order to not lose a lot of energy in transmission. Then the asset health, we wanted it to be a new additional energy and not an old wind park or solar farm being upgraded. And then finally, of course, also the conditions for the agreement had a say. And on the next page, you can then see what we ended up with as a first phase of our renewable energy journey. So last year we established 4 solar parks, as you can see, geographically spread across Denmark. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Danish country, it's a small country just above Germany, but there are distances in the country, and we try to mirror our consumption as good as possible in placing these solar parks across the country. And that means that we here in 2023 are delivering 140 gigawatt hours of green electricity to the Danish grid, additional new green energy that wouldn't have been there if we haven't invested in it. That's approximately 70% of our electricity consumption. So we still have somewhere to go. And I think our consumption in Denmark is around half percent of the total electricity consumption. So as our CEO is saying in the quote here on the right-hand side, it was important for us to take responsibility for the change that is needed, and that is to make Denmark independent of fossil fuels. And by providing Denmark with new renewable energy, we did a good start here. And we're, of course, looking into how to close the rest of our energy consumption with additional energy sources over the coming years. And I think that was it from me, and looking forward to Q&A later.
Thank you very much, Peter, for talking us through your approach to renewables and very ambitious targets there as well, to be net zero by 2030. That's fantastic. So if we move along to our next speaker, very happy to introduce to you Matt Anderson, who is a senior consultant at the Carbon Trust. And Matt is going to be talking to us about how to tackle Scope 3 emissions and effective strategies for that. Hand over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Stephen. First, just want to say hello to everyone, and also that we're really excited to be here to launch the guide today and see the impact that it will have on accelerating the move towards achieving climate targets across the mobile industry. And I also think it's really cool to hear from Peter about TDCnet's ambitions in procuring renewable electricity and applying some of the concepts that we touch on in the guide around things like considering additionality and how you procure renewable electricity. So next slide, please. So what I'll do in the next few minutes is talk through the strategy or strategies discussed in the guide around Scope 3 emissions. So as we saw from Charlotte earlier, typically for a mobile network operator, Scope 3 emissions are going to make up the bulk of a carbon footprint. And a Scope 3 footprint is a really good resource and tool for evaluating emission hotspots and also determining where to put your focus and efforts in your decarbonization strategy. So we'll start just by looking at a representative Scope 3 footprint to give you a sense of where the emission hotspots may be. But typically what we see across the industry with mobile network operators is that category 1 and 2, so purchase goods and services and capital goods, are where the bulk of emissions come from within Scope 3. So that's typically related to the production and manufacturing of physical goods, as well as the inputs and energy required to generate services. We also see category 11, so use of sold products, has a significant contribution to Scope 3 emissions. So typically this is the energy use of customers by products sold by mobile network operator. So for example, devices, handsets, and in some cases, routers and things like that for fixed network. We also see category 15 investments can make a sizable contribution in some cases. This isn't consistent with all operators, but depending on the structure of your organization, joint ventures in particular may make a significant contribution to Scope 3 footprint. So in the next slide, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the makeup of category 1 and 2 emissions, and this can help frame where the opportunities are for assessing emission reductions and developing a strategy. So if we look at another representative Scope 3 footprint focusing specifically on category 1 and 2 emissions, we see kind of 3 broad areas that tend to make up most of those category emissions. And here you can see handsets, network equipment, and then other services really are those 3 categories. And then other devices as well. So that could be things like tablets and routers and things of that nature. So this is helpful just to have in mind because it will guide where you focus your Scope 3 emission reduction strategy. Next slide, please. So this graphic here, I think, does a really good job of summarizing the approach to reducing Scope 3 emissions. And really central to that is collaboration across the supply chain, because Scope 3 footprints and considers the entire value chain, upstream and downstream. Naturally, it's going to rely on really close collaboration across all elements of the supply chain. And the 4 focus areas that we've identified and talk about in the guide relate to the procurement of low carbon network equipment, services, and devices. So this touches back on the makeup of category 1 and 2 emissions that we just looked at. business model innovation and circular economy. And really, this is aiming at addressing emissions from handsets, devices, as well as network equipment, and then opportunities for engagement with investments in joint ventures. As we saw for some MNOs, investments can make a sizable contribution to your Scope 3 footprint. So engaging closely and developing strong relationships with joint ventures is really important. And then finally, to address use phase emissions, engagement in energy policy is really important to drive down emissions in the electrical grid and accelerate the uptake of renewable electricity. Next slide, please. So I think here we're just highlighting that we'll dive a little bit deeper into procurement of low carbon network equipment, services, and devices. And the next slide will take us through what those steps look like. So if we could just move forward one. Thank you. So within the guide, we touch on 5 key focus areas for engaging with suppliers throughout the procurement process, starting with the identification of key suppliers for meaningful engagement and collaboration. So a good starting point is really diving a bit deeper into your Scope 3 footprint and into category 1 and 2 emissions, and determining which suppliers are contributing most to your footprint and which ones you have good relationships with already and opportunities for strong engagement. And you want to leverage those and understand which ones to devote the most focus in collaborating with. Next is signaling the importance of environmental performance as a top-tier design criterion. You'll see in the guide that we actually dive a bit deeper into the contributions from an emission standpoint of products in the mobile industry, such as network equipment and devices. And part of that is actually related to production of semiconductors. So it's going to be really important to have a specific focus as well, working with manufacturers and working with semiconductor fabricators on targeting emission reductions specific to semiconductor production. And then also tying into the focus on circular economy is encouraging maximum longevity through repairability, modularity, and reuse. So this is going to be really important for mobile operators as you work towards reducing your Scope 3 emissions and incorporating take-back schemes and really robust circular economy principles. And then finally, to make sure all of this comes to fruition is including environmental performance targets within your contracts and within your procurement process. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of environmental performance in design and manufacture today, so we looked at the iPhone 14, iPhone 14 Pro, and iPhone SE. Apple does a really good job of publishing product environmental reports where they quantify the product carbon footprint of these devices. And so we looked at this range of smartphones, and you can see actually, if you look at the iPhone 14 and compare it to the iPhone SE, there's actually a reduction in production-related emissions for the iPhone SE. And so that's a 22% reduction in production emissions. And they actually share the same exact system on a chip, the Apple A15 Bionic. So this is a really good example of environmental performance being achievable today with the appropriate design intent. And one thing we talk about in the guide is the level of reduction in emissions from manufacture and production that would be compatible with achieving climate targets. And it's in the range of 30 to 40% reduction from 2020 levels. So we can see already here, we're 2/3 to halfway to bridging that gap with the appropriate design focus. So next slide, please. And so I touched a little bit on it earlier, but the 4 main elements of the approach really rely on engaging the full value chain and beyond. So it's really important to develop strong relationships with joint ventures, for example, when targeting emission reductions within investments. And really, a lot of joint ventures may share similar challenges to other operators in reducing their emissions. So there's a really big opportunity there to share learnings, to improve capabilities of footprinting and reporting, and also work together to drive down emissions. And then also with engagement in energy policy, it's just going to be very critical for mobile operators and for the mobile industry to have a vocal role in advocating for clean energy and accelerating the uptake of renewable electricity across the grid globally in all of the different regions where mobile networks are operating. And next slide, please. So just to round things out, we've shown an illustrative roadmap to achieving Scope 3 climate targets. So as Stephen touched on earlier, there's a lot of ambition in setting climate targets, which should be applauded. And these targets are not going to necessarily be simple to achieve, but there is a path to doing it. And it relies really on having focus across all aspects of the value chain and keeping your eye on the ball to make sure that we're collaborating and driving down emissions and translating these specific targets in the focus areas towards emission reductions. And the last thing I'll say is many near-term targets are for a 2030 target year, and we're set against something like a 2020 baseline. So we're about a third of the way through that process. So there really is a sense of urgency in getting these things together, collaborating, getting the investments to drive forward a lot of these principles. And I believe we can get there, and we just really need to have a strong focus on implementing these actions.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's certainly welcome to hear your optimism and enthusiasm and insights as well. I appreciate you covered a lot, and there's a lot more detail that we go into the guide on Scope 3 emissions. Thank you very much for running through that. And that brings us on to our panel, and the focus of which is going to be on Scope 3 emissions, and in particular on supplier engagement. I think we can see our panelists on the screen at the moment. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Cyril Porat, who is the Chief Procurement Officer at BT Sourced. Thank you for joining us, Cyril. And we also have Andrea McCormack, who is the Group Environmental Lead at Vodafone. Thanks, Andrea. So Cyril, I'll start with you. Perhaps if you could just explain briefly what BT Sourced is and how you work with BT Group itself to drive sustainable procurement.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Stephen, and I'm glad that you're asking me the question. Very excited by what just Matt said, and I'm very aligned as well with Peter. Well, so first of all, so BT Sourced is the procurement company of BT Group. We're based out of Dublin in Ireland, and we have been created in 2021. So we're relatively a new company, which is very, very good, because as you can see, well, I will tell you about what we're doing. It's really investing a lot in digital, and our digital will obviously help us really reducing our Scope 3 emissions. So first of all, BT connects for good. So that's the taglines of BT, and we're really focusing on that. And as the procurement company of BT, we are very much aligned into that. We have the ambition to take procurement into a new era, and we have what we call our strategic platform, which we call it #We Source for Better Futures. And in the Better Futures, we've got 2 dimensions to the Better Future, which is A, the ESG dimension, and 2, investing a lot into the digital. And I will come back later on how that plays into reducing the carbon footprint of BT, and obviously, especially on the Scope 3. So that's a bit what we are at BT Sourced and what we do, and how we are aligned as well with BT's values and commitment in terms of ESG.
Thanks very much, Cyril. Perhaps we can let's dive into carbon targets then and climate targets, because BT was one of the first companies to set a science-based target back in 2008, and since then you've been continuing to push the goalposts and accelerate your ambition. We've seen a pledge for you to be net zero for your own operations, Scope 1 and 2, by I think it's March 2031, and then the full net zero of the value chain by the end of March 2041. So that includes your supply chain and customer emissions as well. We know that measuring, quantifying Scope 3 emissions is challenging. How have you at BT Sourced approached this tricky issue of measuring Scope 3 emissions?
Thank you, Stephen. And first of all, sustainability, as I said just before, it's really at the heart of everything that we do at BT Sourced. It's even in our hashtag that we have here on the wall of our building. And we're taking action, climate action, really, really seriously. And the good stuff as well is that it's not something which is new within BT, because we are doing that for the last 30 years. Actually, so we set our first carbon target in 1992. Which is really well ahead of many, many people. And as you mentioned as well, so we were amongst the few ones to take as well a target back in 2008 into the first science-based target to reduce our carbon emission. So, well, we have been good so far. We're extremely good, I would say. I'm pleased to say that we've been good because we reduced quite a lot of our carbon emissions. With this new zero as well target, into this supply chain within BT. So what we're trying to do is really to try to connect the dots between everything that we're doing on a daily basis and our ability as well to connect all the information from our suppliers. So what we have heard just before, it's key to have this very tight connection between our supply base and us, just to discuss about how we will reduce our carbon footprint. And what I was just saying before is that we're trying to play big in terms of digital tools and AI to be able to connect with our suppliers and to be able to track as well the carbon footprint. I was enjoying what Matt was showing, for example, on the iPhone. So meaning that how you are connecting basically from manufacturing facility and even going even further from the raw materials up to the end of your customer. So the carbon footprint. So for that, we've got quite a lot of digital platforms that we're using within BT Sourced that we're connecting our suppliers to, and that are used for us really to deep dive into all those elements and trying to work with them to improve and release, or with the idea as well of reducing our target, as you said, by 2041, to improve the way we work and the way we are connecting. So that's a bit what we are doing.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for talking us through that. Andrea, maybe coming across to you, and Vodafone also has science-based targets as well, and a net zero target by 2040. You also made headlines last year because you're one of the principal partners of COP27 in Egypt as well. How is Vodafone going about estimating Scope 3 emissions so that you can understand the level of carbon reductions that are going to be required?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So I think, as you say, really understanding what our greenhouse gas emissions footprint is the first step in helping us to understand how to reduce those emissions. So we have a model that we work with the Carbon Trust on to estimate our Scope 3 emissions across all 15 categories. And there's three, I guess, big groupings that we look at. One is our upstream emissions from our supply chain. As Matt was explaining earlier, that's the goods and the services that we purchase through our procurement team. And then we've got our downstream emissions, which are to do with the use of our products that we sell to our customers, and the energy that entails. And then we also have quite a big contribution from investments that we make. So where we are financing other companies who have emissions, which we're partly responsible for, and we take responsibility for that. I think the key thing with the model is that it improves over time. So when we started out on this journey looking at our Scope 3 emissions, it was very much based on industry average emission factors and database sets that use proxy data. And over time, we are increasingly moving that to product-specific data that we are obtaining through engagement with our suppliers, through more specific product carbon footprinting data sets. And that really allows us to really target our understanding of our Scope 3 emissions and pinpoint where we need to have action. It also means that when we start having these conversations with our suppliers and with our partners about how they can take action to reduce their emissions, that we should start to see that feeding through in the data that they give to us about the product carbon footprint of the things that they sell to us. So we should be able to see the efforts reflected in the data that we estimate. So I think, yeah, a really important point is that we have that estimation model, but that we improve data over time. This is very much a science that's still in the making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's That's become really clear in terms of the Scope 3 methodology guidance that we've been working on over the last year, that it's definitely an iterative process, and you kind of start with something that's broader and then you kind of get more precise over time. And I understand, Andrea, just staying with you and Vodafone, that you've got a plan to halve carbon emissions in your supply chain by 2030, I think it is.
Yes, that's right.
What actions are you putting in place in order to achieve that?
So I think there's three really key things that we've already made really good progress and laid some fantastic foundations on. The first is in supplier engagement and incentives for our suppliers to start greening their own operations. So, for example, we have a 20% weighting within our supplier evaluation criteria, and that's all around purpose, which includes climate. So, for example, we look at whether or not they've set targets, how aligned they are to a 1.5 degree pathway, how they're disclosing information about climate, for example, through CDP, and their commitment to things like renewable electricity. So those elements make up and contribute to our decisions about which suppliers we work with. And over time, we would like to see our supplier base becoming more green, so scoring better in those scores. We've also thought about some innovative ways to try and incentivize suppliers to start taking action on that journey. So earlier this year, we launched together with CDP and with Citi a new mechanism for supply chain financing, which offers preferential rates for our suppliers who are able to score better in a selection of the CDP questions that relate to climate performance. So again, like just providing some small nudges to help our supply chain think about how they can take action. A couple of other areas where we're also working on already include circularity. So I think we've talked a little bit on this call already about the importance of increasing the longevity of devices, repairability, and then refurbish and etc. And that will help us to bring down the emissions that we get from purchasing new devices, for example. So we've already running a number of initiatives in that area. We're working with WWF on a campaign that we launched with them last year to try and encourage more customers to bring back used phones, reaching 1 million phones for the planet under that campaign. And then lastly, we're trying to help our consumers to think about their choices when it comes to technology. So we're one of the companies that are a founding member of Eco Rating, which is an eco-labeling scheme for smartphones. This helps to just provide really simple and accessible information for customers on different elements of environmental impact for smartphones, so that they can think about that when they're making their purchasing choices. And then hopefully we will start to see a movement over time towards devices that have a lower impact. So there's a few examples of the actions that we're taking.
Fantastic. Yeah, a few really excellent examples there of things that I think are going to really make a difference. Thanks, Andrea. Cyril, I understand BT has put in place a process for identifying and engaging your top suppliers. How many are you targeting, and how exactly are you going about doing this?
Yeah, so thank you, Stephen, for asking a question. And I would say, when I was listening to Andrea, so we've got, and I'm glad to hear that as an industry, we're all heading in the same direction. So what we're doing when it comes to our top suppliers, we look at very much our supply base, and basically what Matt was showing just before. So we did exactly the same analysis and we used the same framework. So we landed with 140 of them. So 140 of them, which are really key for us. And what we're asking them to do is basically to commit on the same 1.5 aligned science-based targets. We had a webinar with them, so we've seen a lot of enthusiasm. When people join us during this webinar, it was really interesting to see all the comments, and I'm assuming that we have like as well a lot of questions coming from the people which are attending the event today. A lot of excitement, and what we asked them as well to do is to take tangible commitments. When I'm saying tangible commitment, we asked them to really go public about these targets, because we believe that if they are going public, the whole organization, and not just only the people we're dealing with on a daily basis, but the whole organization will be aligned on these targets. And then so you would have more tractions. And then so what we're expecting from that as well is that their own suppliers and the suppliers of their suppliers will go even further. So the idea is really to start with the top 140, ask them to make a very public commitment when it's come to this 1.5 science-based targets, and making sure that really they are basically implementing that not only within the company and not just only with the salespeople that we're leading, but really across all the organization. And then after that, they are cascading that into their own supply base. So that's what we're looking at. What we will do, obviously, so we will make sure that they are making this pledge publicly. We will make sure as well that they will be able to report progress, and we will as well report progress as well on this. We've got, as I said, a full digital ecosystem that we will use to collect and to interact with our suppliers, which is a tool which is called Kodiak Hub. And we've got relatively a very aggressive timelines, because we want to complete the assessment of these 140 suppliers by June of this year. We want them to agree on the target by October of this year, and to have all the targets in place by March 2024. So what we are doing is really trying to leverage the overall ecosystem, did exactly the same analysis, landed on 140 suppliers, asking them really to make this pledge publicly, making sure that even their supply base as well would be aligned, tracking them, making sure that we have got the overall ecosystem super motivated and going into the same direction, and having, I would say, very ambitious targets when it comes to the timelines.
That's really useful to understand. I'm conscious of a little bit of time. I've got many more questions. Actually, I'd be happy to run through with you, but perhaps we can cover some of them off in the Q&A at the end. Perhaps just one final one for you both, actually, and that is, both BT and Vodafone have been on a decarbonisation journey now for actually a number of years. Where do you think you are on the journey, and where do you think you'll be in 3 years' time? Perhaps Andrea, I'll come to you.
I think the title of this webinar is pretty good. So, target set, tick, we've done that. Now, where do we go from here? I think for Vodafone, we've set our strategy. We have put in place governance to oversee the delivery of that strategy and a good operating model. So we've got all of the foundations that are needed to accelerate action. I think the challenge really now for us is mainstreaming. So how do we start to shift mindsets across the business, think about incentives and objectives that we need to put in place to really shift and move the dial on that. It's really important that we have a network of change agents right across different functions, and because we need them to be able to start making changes to those processes and the decisions that we make in order to be able to shift that dial. So I think that's kind of where we are. Last thing I'd say is that I think in a few years' time, what I would hope is that this action is really embedded into our business plans, into our budget cycles, into really embedded into the way that we think about how we do business, and that we're acting more cross-industry and collaborating with others on this really important agenda.
Thanks, Andrea. And Cyril, how do you see it from BT's side?
Well, it's very interesting, because if you look at Matt was very clear about the fact that most of in our business, most of our carbon emissions are coming from the Scope 3. So our procurement team is basically the people which are on a daily basis managing our supply chain or interacting with our supply chain. So beyond what Andrea was just saying, which we're quite aligned and should not be a surprise to a certain extent, what we're trying to do as well is to make that part of the DNA of our procurement teams, because many people within the procurement organization tend to be focused on savings, technology, stuff like that. And what we have done, as I explained at the beginning, so we have this strategic platform, we source for a better future. So meaning that every day when people are entering into our building, so they see that we source for a better future, we source, which is, I would say, the one of the job that they are doing, but for a better future. So there's definitively this ESG dimension. And what we're trying to do as well to change a bit the mindset, or to put them into the right mindset. So we had we cleaned the beach, for example. Very soon we will clean the canal as well. So very, I would say, big stuff, but as well very small stuff, but very concrete, where people will do hands-on stuff on the ground. So understanding that every action that they are taking as a procurement professional might have big repercussion, obviously, on the environment. And just doing that will be obviously something which is enabling them to be more concrete. And what we have done as well, so we run an ESG risk simulation. So we put ourselves into, well, there's big ESG events, our supply chain is involved, how you're reacting to that, really to make them more aware of the impact that it can have on the overall supply chain and the carbon emission of our industry and BT, obviously. So big, I would say, big aspiration, but as well very concrete actions on the field where people can feel with their own hands and sense the urgency of acting on that topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Cyril. So we'll pause it there, but perhaps we can return for some Q&A in a few minutes. Thanks very much for running through that. And sorry we didn't get to run through all of the questions. If we just then flip onto the last section, which will be presented by Laura Tedeschi, who is Business Development Manager and ICT Sector Lead at the Carbon Trust. And Laura, you're going to be talking us through how to embed a climate strategy into your business.
Exactly. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you everyone for tuning in. So we have touched on this during the webinar, but climate targets can feel a bit daunting. So they will require businesses to really look how their business model will still be relevant in a net zero future. So the best way to move forward is to really look into how to develop a clear implementation plan to achieve your science-based targets. So if we move on to the next slide, there are 4 key steps that companies should follow when developing an implementation plan. So the first one is to really look at the range of carbon reduction opportunities that you have, model these opportunities into a feasibility assessment to determine your gap to target, update this model over time, over your target time frame, and make sure that you're on the right path. And then the final step is to really operationalize this analysis and make sure that you have the right business structure within your company for it to be a success. So if we move on to the next slide, the first step is to incorporate your carbon reduction opportunities into an implementation plan. So this involves really creating a summary of all the opportunities that you have across your value chain. And as Charlotte mentioned earlier, really assessing the carbon reduction potential, the cost, the time, the ease of implementation, and really prioritize this across these parameters, making sure that you prioritize the one that can be implemented across your target time frame. Of course, as we're talking about initiatives that will impact different teams within your organization, it's crucial that you bring in your leadership team early to gain their support and that they are aware that the changes that will need to be implemented to achieve your science-based targets. The second step, if we move to the next slide, is to model the emission inventories to determine the feasibility of your implementation plan. So the first step is to investigate what would be your business as usual pathway in the case that you will not implement any carbon reduction activity. So your BAU pathway can be based on your projected company growth and industry trends. Then you would need to look into modeling the emission reductions based on the implementation plan that you've already developed to understand the feasibility of achieving your science-based target and if there is any gap to target. And then the last step is to really revisit and update your feasibility assessment throughout the target timeframe. And this means looking at the opportunities that you have implemented, making sure that there are new ones that are getting added to the analysis, and potentially have this type of exercise at least annually. The third step into developing a successful implementation plan is to account for and track emission reductions over time. So we talked as part of step 2 about implementing new opportunities, but of course, the update should also include your value chain emissions. So it's key that you follow the latest Scope 3 measurement guidance. Restating might also be needed when you improve your data quality. And this, of course, has the aim to ensure that you have a consistent baseline for tracking your progress against the targets. Collaboration with industry groups is also essential. GSMA, GESI, and ITU, for example, have just developed a new Scope 3 guidance for telecommunication operators that is trying to take that step forward from the GHG protocol to help companies measure their value chain emissions more accurately. And of course, as you move along your climate journey, it's important to to push for suppliers to disclose their product level data, so that this type of data feeds them back into your value chain emissions and carbon inventory. The last step in the implementation plan process is to really enable the success within your business. So if we move to the next slide, there are 4 key steps into this. So of course, the key message is to really look into operationalizing your carbon reduction strategy within your business. And this happens, for example, by ensuring accountability, above all at senior level. So making sure that the board pushes for climate action and that the C-level has clear responsibility for moving towards your climate goals. Team motivation is also key. So you have to ensure that adequate resources are devoted to climate action, that the teams feel empowered in investigating innovative business models, and that performance is really incorporated into remuneration. Climate action really needs to be a priority also through, again, remuneration, but also procurement processes, risks and opportunities planning, and internal carbon pricing. The last step is to be very transparent and vocal around the climate advocacy. So this means making sure that you have budget allocated to engage with public policy bodies, trade associations, and industry associations to make sure that that systemic change is then reflected also in the public sector. So this concludes our overview of the guide. I'm going to pass it back to Stephen now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Appreciate you running through that. Lots of useful hints, tips, and recommendations there for embedding climate strategy within the business. And I think that gives us some time actually at the end, which we hoped we would have to talk through some Q&A. So I'd like to welcome back all of the speakers that we've had today. So Laura, Andrea, Matt, Charlotte, Cyril, and Peter. And I see we have had a few questions dropped in the comments underneath. So perhaps, Peter, if we start with you, there's a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one is TDC also considering to add batteries or storage in order to time shift the usage of electricity to better align with solar production?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that. The answer is yes, we're looking into that because I think next part of our journey, if we want to do it right, is to be covered as much as possible over the day by renewables. So I think the next project we're also looking into is supplementary sources of energy. So in Denmark, it would be wind, because Denmark is a great wind country. So I think alone, some of the analysis that we've made is that we can actually be 80% covered by wind and solar in itself over a course of a day. But of course, there are changes during the day, and sometimes the wind is not blowing, sometimes the sun is not shining. So we're also looking into flexibility in our electricity grid, actually, because we have a lot of equipment that can instantly give some kind of flexibility to the grid that we can get back at some later time when we need it. And that could be, for example, batteries. Yeah, interesting part of the next journey.
Thank you very much, Peter. The other question that came in was around if you think your 2030 target is achievable and how you're planning to tackle Scope 3 emissions.
It is achievable. I think that's also why we got the approval from the Science Based Target Initiative. I think we went through several interviews with the team there in order to look into our plan, and I hope everyone will look into our plan in our published sustainability report because we think it is realistic to get there. And the reasons why are mainly that we as digital infrastructure providers have a large part of our scope is electricity, because our product, our user-sold product, is basically electricity driven. And for that, we have in the Danish market a very, very, very good environment for going green on that. We are a Danish operator only, so we are only in Denmark. We don't have businesses outside of Denmark that we need to take care of, and we have a very good regulatory environment in Denmark to do it. And then finally, our vendors, Scope 3 vendors are joining us on the journey, and they want to move ahead with us on this. So that's some of the key arguments why we believe it's achievable, and why we believe we then have an option to go for it.
Thanks, Peter. Well, that's very good to hear. Cyril, there were a couple of questions that came in that relate to the tools that are being used by BT for measuring and tracing emissions. I wonder if you'd be happy to talk a little bit more about what tools you're using.
Yes, yes, Steve. So it's obviously a journey, and then we're like well placed right now, but there's still a long way to go. And what we have started to do, and we're using a tool which is called Risk Method, even though it was at the beginning designed for the risk, but we extended that much more as well on the ESG part. And we have pinned basically our more than 10,000 suppliers everywhere in the planet where they are. And then so we're trying, as well as just mentioned before, to understand our tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. So we are currently working with a startup based out of Cambridge, VerseAI, to call what we do our supply chain illumination. So understanding exactly where all the products are coming from. And then so we're overly on top of that, the carbon. So meaning that I can see, for example, that this product has been manufactured there, has been shipped to that place, has been shipped to the UK. And then from the UK, that's where my distribution center are. And that's what we're doing. So we're using this tool. We're using as well the other tool to understand better our full supply chain and not just only our tier 1. And then so we're currently piloting several applications just to basically track at every step, because we have now the logistic path of the product at every step, basically the carbon emission. So as I said, we're well into our journey, but there's still a lot to do to be able to have the full picture.
Thanks for that, Cyril. Andrea, perhaps I could ask you a question we didn't get to cover off before, actually, and that was, have you faced any challenges or pushback from your strategic suppliers on what you're looking to do to reduce supply chain emissions?
So I would say, like, not pushback. I think right across the industry, people recognise that climate change is a really urgent and existential problem. And I think in general, people and other companies and our suppliers very much want to take action. I think like where the challenge comes is a bit more at the practical level. So thinking about how we align on plans, how we share data, the availability of data, the availability of resources to get that data. There are some technical challenges. So I think those are the details. I think where we're seeing challenges, common challenges between us and our suppliers that we need to work together to overcome. So very much not a pushback on the ambition, but we're all learning as we go along on how we figure out how to really push forward action on the ground.
Thanks very much. There was another question that came in around whether the level of maturity of mobile operators worldwide is at a similar level on sustainability topics. I mean, I have a view on this from the GSMA side, but perhaps I can ask the Carbon Trust, because you work with a lot of mobile network operators. So what do you see? Is everyone sort of clustered around the same area, or is there quite a big disparity?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So we do work with telcos, across the globe in many different regions. I think there is some variation in maturity in terms of knowledge and understanding of sustainability topics and reporting, and also just level of action taken to date. So that is something we recognize. I think the GSMA does an excellent job of providing the resources to really accelerate the, bridging that knowledge gap and bringing everyone up to the right level of knowledge and ambition. But yes, I think there is definitely some variation region to region in terms of maturity.
If I may add to that, Stephen, so because I had a chance to work 10 years ago into the Middle East, and I can see that 10 years ago it was not a topic, and my colleagues now are all over the place when it comes to sustainability. So you can see that the mobile operator, at least in some part of the world, in 10 years have made huge moves. So I would say we tend to align, but really to the which is good.
Absolutely, and I'm going to take this as a neat segue to round off our discussion, because I think it encapsulates what we've been talking about today, which is, bringing everyone up to the level of the climate leaders that we've had on the call today. So I want to thank you very much for our speakers for joining us and talking through your excellent climate strategies, which I think are going to be very useful to our listeners. Carbon Trust for helping us develop this guide. Please do take a look at the guide. There's huge amounts of useful information in it. And I'm sure this won't be the only webinar that we do on this topic, because there's a lot more that we would like to dive into and explore. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.